So if we want to do something about inequality, then what can we do? Well, we saw that Sweden is able to take income that was just as unequal as the United States, and through taxes and transfers, reduce inequality in disposable income quite significantly. So you can imagine putting a high tax rate on very high earners and giving a lot of benefits to people who need them, right? Whether that's in terms of food stamps like we have in the United States, property, housing vouchers, etc. We could also try to re-equalize endowments, right? So we could have property redistribution, a higher inheritance tax, a higher um, support for poor people in terms of what they can own. And we could also change the rules in terms of how workers interact with firms, how lenders interact with borrowers, right? So we'll look at a minimum wage first. We could have it for all workers, we could have it for a specific type of workers, and we can see how that might work. So here we imagine, if we have a secondary labor market with a group that has been discriminated against, if we add a minimum wage so that they have to be paid a higher wage, right? Not necessarily higher than the other group, right? You can see that this is not as high because it has a somewhat flatter slope, but they do have to get paid more than they had been getting paid. That shifts the Lorenz curve in and reduces inequality. And so one of the questions about the minimum wage is whether or not it's going to simply rebalance bargaining power between low skilled workers and their employers, or whether it's going to lead those employers to use labor saving technology and not hire those workers anymore. The answer is probably both, but so far the evidence points to the fact that a higher minimum wage doesn't destroy jobs in the short run anyway. It's going to be interesting. We have a lot of states and cities that are implementing minimum wages of up to $15 an hour, and we'll see what the effects are there. We have some evidence from Seattle, and there's some mixed evidence so far. So it'll be interesting to see what happens with higher minimum wages. There are a number of countries that have taken, the inequality and tried to reduce it. And so if we look at some European countries along with Japan, we can see that the top 1% income share hasn't gone back up. Remember, for the United States, it's up here around 20% right now. But for these countries, it's all still, between 7 and 10%. That's a big difference. And, it's back where we were in the golden era of capitalism. And this shows that these countries, which are rich countries, just like the United States, you can choose institutions that are more likely to lead to a more equitable distribution of income. So one question also is the relationship between inequality and growth, right? Some economists have argued that in order to grow, we need to have an unequal economic environment so that people have the incentive to take risks and invest and be highly rewarded for that. What we can see is that there's very little relationship really between the Gini coefficient and real GDP growth. And there are some economists that argue that actually higher income inequality hurts growth. So if we look at a long-term average of the Gini coefficient and disposable income here on the horizontal axis, and average real GDP growth per capita on the vertical axis, we can see that the United States is here, higher inequality, sort of mid-range growth, whereas Luxembourg, Norway, Finland, Austria, they have had higher real GDP per capita growth and lower income inequality. So there's really, there's very little relationship between these two variables, and it really seems to have more to do with institutional arrangements than anything else. If we look at developing countries, we can see even again that there are some countries such as Korea and Taiwan that have had low inequality and high growth, whereas a lot of other countries have had high inequality and low growth. Um, Again, I mean, I'd rather be a poor person in Taiwan or Korea than in Brazil or Mexico. If we look, another problem with inequality is that it may lead to higher crime rates. And so this is just a graph of income inequality on the horizontal axis and the number of protective service employees. So, you know, police officers, corrections officers, etc., on the vertical axis. And you can see that there does seem to be a positive relationship. Denmark has, you know, very few protective services employees and low inequality, whereas the United States has gone from bad to worse in terms of higher inequality and more police officers and correctional officers. So if we think about, you know, where inequality comes from, we can think about the competition within markets, bargaining power between employers and employees, the tax rates, minimum wages, protection of public property, etc., excuse me, private property. All of those institutions impact economic inequality directly. We can also think about technology, right? Is it doing more to boost productivity and wages, or is it doing more to replace workers with labor-saving technology? That's going to impact economic inequality. And then there's going to be a whole bunch of other institutions and rules that are going to impact both inequality in the immediate term and in the long term when we're thinking about intergenerational inequality. So things like inheritance taxes, land reforms, intellectual property rights, rule of law, changes in supply and demand. All of these things are going to affect how people earn their income and whether or not they have the chance to succeed. In addition, all economic inequality is going to lead to changes in the next generation, right? It's going to lead to differences in endowments. It's going to lead to changes in technology. It's going to lead to changes in institutions. And I think that's one of the more interesting questions is, can you get in sort of a vicious cycle in which you end up with a lot of inequality? Those people have economic power that then gets translated to political power, and then they change the institutions in order to protect that economic power.